So at the end of the day, I think one thing I've learned is that the creativity of work in this field is always distributed, that's clear, and always located, that's clear as well. And that seems very paradoxical if I think back over the career. Distributed in the sense that it's always very difficult to pinpoint, in fact one shouldn't even try, the person, the unique moment, or the individual who prompted all this work to happen. And yet at the same time, it's very much a particular site and a particular place that seems crucial for the most important, most creative, most dynamic moments. Again, there's obviously a reflexivity there. This is the question that my subdiscipline has to answer. It has to answer the question, whence this astonishing, innovative activity and its successes and problems. And the quick and dirty answer is that we're dealing with a complex of at least these two processes, spatialization and localization. Spatialization is that astonishing technique that certain enterprises and societies seem to have mastered, which is making what works in one place work elsewhere, and in principle everywhere, and in principle anywhere. How is that done? In the history of experiment, that's called replication. In the history of the economy, that's called commodity production. In the history of philosophy, that's called the problem of induction. And they're clearly related to each other. On the other hand, the solution to those problems is localizing, is to bring resources, heterogeneous resources, to a point, march to the sound of the guns. So when one looks at a particular laboratory, or a particular desk, or a particular workshop, or a fortiori, as Jerry always taught us, a particular piece of hardware, you're dealing with a hybrid complex of entities, elements and resources that have been brought together in a single place from all over the globe. Look at an 18th century electrical machine. One has mahogany, glass, silk, leather, brass and ivory, all conjoined in an astonishingly ingenious arrangement to produce a power that had never been produced that way before, since the creation of the world. And if you tie strings from a beautiful 18th century Nairn electrical machine to the places and times whence all those components come, you will have mapped the networks of global trade, commerce, empire, scholarship, learning and conflict, from China, silk, to Africa, ivory, to the subcontinent, mahogany, to Limehouse, the glass, to a field somewhere in Berkshire, the leather, to the dissenting academies of Merseyside, to the Lunar Society, to Cambridge University, to the Royal Court of Queen Elizabeth I, where the word electric is first used by her physician William Gilbert. So bringing all that together into a single place and then making it work, and then doing something completely different and unanticipated with this. Let 10 decades go past and this becomes, mutatis mutandis, a cathode ray machine. Let another 10 decades go past and it becomes a flat screen television. How is that possible? That's the question, that's the kind of question that I think we can answer, but it takes an incredibly long time. And I guess what I've learned is that there are many different media which we should be using to show what the answer to that question might be.
Wonderful. Can I just take it on one stage too? Because I usually ask people how working in Cambridge has helped them, and also more generally in your case, Cambridge as a creative environment.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Well, I've tried to answer this question on a number of occasions, all of them completely surreal. The most amusing and provocative one was as follows. So this is a roundabout way of explaining
the Nobel Prize.
why Cambridge matters, yes. About a very close friend and guru of mine, Svante Lindqvist, took the job of setting up and administering a museum of the Nobel Prize, which opened in Stockholm, in the old stock exchange, actually, in the old part of town, just a few years ago. Svante is an immensely brilliant and impressive technology historian. He wrote the definitive book on the introduction of the steam engine into Sweden, and a lovely article, this is not irrelevant, on glassblowing as the key technology of the modern world. It's called Variations on a Wagnerian Theme. I love this article. So someone with those interests and knowledges, this is quite a challenge. How do you show the Nobel Prize? What is there to show, after all? Cerebral convolutions? The results of IQ tests? He had a very clever idea, which, amongst many others, which was to note that in the century that the Nobel Prize system has run, certain places have been peculiarly good at winning it, and clearly Cambridge is certainly one of them. Indeed, one or two of the Cambridge colleges, Trinity would be a very good example, have had more members win the Nobel Prize than most countries. So there's something in the water in these particular places. Princeton would be another, the Chicago Economics Department another, a particular cafe in Budapest, a particular street in Tokyo, a particular school. So he commissioned a group of marvellous Swedish filmmakers to make 15-minute films about these special places. And he hired a really impressive young Swedish filmmaker, Karin Växjö, probably mispronounced that, to make a film about Cambridge. And he indicated to her that she might get something out of talking to me. She decided to make a film which followed a carrot from a fenland farm to St John's College High Table, and to use that as the trope or the spine of the film, and then around that a series of interviews with Cambridge people about the networked quality of the city. So she sat me down at the bottom of the stair in my home, in my house, and I just talked. And what occurred to me to say was that Cambridge has been, and this is certainly true for me, astonishingly rewarding and supportive, because it's sufficiently withdrawn and sufficiently hybrid to provide mixtures of resources when one needs them. Withdrawn in the sense that it provides, and this is notorious, a certain kind of retreat. It's not perhaps as insulated as it would often like to be, or as it's often represented. Absolutely not. A lot of the work that I've done on the history of science in Cambridge has pointed out the extreme porosity of the university with respect to the rest of the world. My work on Newton, for example, which I'm about to publish, which is called Newton on the Beach, indicates that he may have seemed to have been isolated and cloistered, but if one looks at the data that he was able to command from his rooms in Cambridge in the second half of the 17th century, it's very well linked with global information order, to use Chris Bailey's expression. Nevertheless, the capacity to withdraw has always been indispensable, and of course one worries a lot about the challenges to that capacity. Yet on the other hand, precisely because it is not secluded, and it is not cloistered, and it is not insulated, there's constant porosity, there's constant, as it were, permeability of the membranes. The juxtaposition of unanticipated skills, I think, has been absolutely crucial for me. So that relatively effortlessly, one can assemble teams of people with the most surprisingly heterogeneous interests and skills, relatively frictionlessly, at relatively cheap cost. And as we've been saying, that's a key to being creative. Not in the banal sense that one is most creative when one is in mixed company. I think that probably isn't true, actually. One is most creative when one is trying to survive in mixed company. It's a very different kind of activity to explain to a well-meaning but under-informed close personal friend exactly what the point of what one's doing is and how she can help. That's when a good idea occurs, right? This is the strength of weak ties that Granovetter talked about decades ago, that an entirely autarkic institution, which Cambridge always has the danger of becoming, is utterly disastrous. In that sense, one should be a very strong believer in the pursuit of knowledge under difficulties, as many of the great Victorians were. On the other hand, an indefinite group of, as it were, mechanically solidarity-driven persons is very unlikely to produce anything worthwhile. The team photo should be taken after the work is over, not before. Right? It's very much part of the victory celebration rather than a way of ensuring that victory will be won. The reason why those astonishing disciplinary images, which Cambridge is very good at generating, of, say, the students of a particular private mathematics tutor like Hopkins or Routh in the 19th century are so astonishing. And one sees Kelvin and Maxwell and Stokes and so on, all, as it were, sitting next to each other, is because of what they've just been doing elsewhere, and not on their own, but with others, and in highly mixed and complicated company, right? So it's easy to make a certain kind of mistake about autarky, and it's easy to make a certain kind of mistake about outreach, the two bugbears, the Scylla and Charybdis, it seems to me, of what I'm trying to describe.
Is it not summarised by Jerry? Bounded but leaky.
Exactly, yes. There's a hole in my bucket, but not a very big one. If there are no holes, you're doomed, and if it's just a sieve, then you're probably doomed as well. That's exactly right. He always had the most pithy expression. And the leakage is what has always impressed me, and what's always been the most useful, and the most extraordinary, actually, eye-opening experiences. The visitors passing through, the technicians, without whom none of us would survive, and I'd never have had a good idea ever, the unknown collections, which both vivify the work and must be constantly energized to stay in operation. The strangely motivated student, the bizarre shelving system of the university library, which means that actually a very substantial number of books that I've read are within 10 metres of the books that I've been looking for, normally in South Front 4 and 5, because they shelve their books by size, which is just a brilliant idea. they could shelve them by colour, but the fact that they shelve them by size and loosely by discipline is magnificent. And the strange intimacies that this produces as well, so that one can be very friendly without being collegial, and very collegial without the burden of having to be friendly. All of those things, I think, are valuable. There are, let me emphasise this though, enormous dangers. This is a fragile system, right, in both respects. One danger is the danger, which is always really serious, of confusing the defence of autonomy with the defence of elitism. And on the other hand, confusing the demand for outreach, which is crucial, with the demand for abandonment, in a certain sense, of the intellectual work that we're trying to do. Were one not involved in this multifarious range of activities, I think it would be very hard to defend what's going on here. And were what's going on here not productive, it would be indefensible. And I think that balance is, frankly, increasingly hard to strike. And one way of saying that is that my work, for example, so far as it goes, has wanted to emphasise just how implicated in empire and industry and capitalist society the work of this institution has been, and vice versa, without ever reducing it to, oh, this is knowledge in the service of empire, hierarchy, class, and capital. That's not what's gone on. And yet the porosity and the entanglement of those social forces with this institution is patent and indispensable. So that, I think, strikes the right kind of balance. And if that balance can be maintained, then I'm relatively optimistic. If not, then, which I think is a pretty characteristic Cambridge view, one has, as it were, optimism of the intellect and pessimism of the will. Right? I think we can go on doing some of the best work that we have been doing, but no one can quite work out how.
Just one last question, Simon. I mean, you mentioned empire, and it sort of links with my own work. Rivers, W.H. Rivers. How did you get interested in rivers?
Rivers, so William House Rivers, not to be confused with anyone else of the same name, was a physiologist, medic, an anthropologist, a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, a therapist, a teacher, a self-experimenter, a traveller, an ethnographer, and a politician, amongst other things. And I learnt about him from Anita Hurley, because Rivers was a member of the Torres Strait expedition from Cambridge to these islands between Australia and New Guinea, led by A.C. Haddon in 1898, and played a major role in that expedition's work, including the psychometric tests that were conducted on the beach and elsewhere in the islands. And his work in that respect was immediately fascinating for me, because one of the things that's always interested me is what one might call the extramural laboratory. How can the exterior world be changed so that one can learn about it? If one doesn't transform the world, one can't know it. But the world one wants to know about is the world before it's so transformed. And Rivers's strategies seem to raise really interesting questions about that. So that was my initial entree in the late 90s. There was a major conference that Anita co-organised at St John's, which was Rivers's college, on the relation between anthropology and psychology in the wake of his work. Also, Anita took the family to the Torres Strait in 1996 as part of her planning around work for the Torres Strait project that she's been engaged on. So I was privileged on now twice to visit the Torres Straits and to meet Torres Strait Islanders, both there and in their many visits to Cambridge, and to welcome them to our house. And that raised a whole series of questions, of course, for someone with absolutely no anthropological training whatsoever about what was at stake in making this sort of knowledge. A second strand was reading the decisive work of George Stocking, the historian par excellence of anthropology, who wrote a magnificent article about the roots of the anthropological work of Rivers' greatest contemporary, Franz Boas, in which Stocking points out the way in which Boas had begun as, in the late 19th century, training as a physicist, essentially, and had moved to ethnography and anthropology, and how the traces of that initial laboratory training marked a lot of Boas's work. And I began to ask, well, I wonder if this is true of Rivers, given that Rivers in the 1880s and 90s was doing state-of-the-art work in optical physics and optical physiology, in fatigue studies with Kraepelin, and in a whole series of self-experiments, which are notorious and famous. And one motivation for that was, as it were, to stop treating laboratory science as the unmoved mover in this story. Always to try and be more reflexive, to think, well, if it's true that this laboratory work provides someone like Rivers the most charismatic, apparently saintly figure in the history of British anthropology, with decisive resources for what he then wants to do in the Torres Strait, elsewhere in Melanesia, in India with the totems, and of course in his therapeutic work during the First World War with Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen and many others at Craig Lockhart. Is it possible to use Rivers' work to analyse laboratory science, and not just to treat his interests in and mastery of laboratory processes as a means of unfolding what he was doing in the field and in the clinic? So when I was asked to give a departmental talk at the social anthropology department, which was a rare and wonderful privilege, I thought to speak to that issue. In other words, is it possible to fold back Rivers' work into a rethinking of laboratory science? And to do this is a ridiculously grandiose way of putting it, a kind of Plutarchian exercise on Boas and Rivers, because they clearly have much in common even though they differ. And our friend Keith Hart then did me the honour of publishing a version of this paper in one of his early Prickly Pear pamphlets, sponsored by the Association of Amateur Anthropology, the AAA, which became which I'm still one of the longest and best illustrated pieces I've ever written. And I've stayed with Rivers for reasons which I suspect are linked to the reasons why everybody stays with Rivers, which is that he's a ghost. He still haunts this town and many other towns. Almost everybody I know who's really worked on Rivers is either, at the strongest end, in love with him, as Bartlett was. Bartlett, of course, his successor as the manager of Cambridge Experimental Psychology and author of I Discover, a text first in English to use the expression social construction and social constructionism, which was introduced towards the end of Bartlett's Remembering. Well, Bartlett saw Rivers some time after Rivers died, and
as a ghost.
As a ghost, yes, and remained inspired by and provoked by that ghost, and that inspiration leads, not entirely indirectly, to the work of David Bloor through Cambridge Experimental Psychology. And therefore, as David has pointed out in a number of stunning papers, Rivers is, as it were, the great-grandfather the sociology of scientific knowledge in which I was trained. But I didn't know that until David showed me it was so. Similarly, Cambridge anthropology's relationship with rivers is extraordinarily conflicted. On the one hand, he's enormously honoured, and on the other hand, he's defined precisely as whatever it is you do that's splendid but isn't anthropology. So that the lecture that the Cambridge Social Anthropology Department occasionally holds, where it invites folk from outside the field to talk about how the field has helped them in their non-anthropological work, is named after rivers. I find that very interesting because there's an ambivalence there, I think, about the great man. And those ambivalences are always a good sign of something worth thinking about hard. If something is that difficult to manage and yet that rich and provoking a century later, you should think about it very, very closely indeed.
We've had 46 minutes. Is there anything I have forgotten to ask you and you would like to have said? This may not be the last occasion, so you don't have to.
I mean, one other thing very briefly that I think I would want to say is that a lot of what we've been talking about is more general than merely reflections on the subdiscipline in which I work, right? And I think that the question of disciplinarity raises its ugly but fascinating head here, right? We're facing, I think, a real political and economic crisis within the academy at this point. And it's a crisis which is well defined around the notion of discipline. Because on the one hand, we're told once upon a time there were rigid, well-recognised, formal, loyalty-commanding disciplines. Everyone knew where they were within the academy. And now we live in an epoch of fluidity and hybridity and multi- and interdisciplinarity, of large-scale collaboration, of public-private partnerships, and what some of my colleagues call a new mode of the production of knowledge. On the other hand, so according to that story, rigid disciplinarity within the sciences has over the past generation disappeared or melted somewhat. On the other hand, we also know that this rigid disciplinarity, if it ever existed, allegedly didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. It didn't exist before roughly 1789 to 1848. Right? It was then, we're told by most historians, that the modern form of disciplinarity came into being. So we're facing, on the one hand, a series of urgent political and economic and administrative stories that tell us that our tradition is passing away, multiplied by a series of stories that tell us that what we took to be our tradition isn't really our tradition at all. And that apparent paradox is utterly characteristic of a lot of the work that people, I think, in the history of the sciences and elsewhere are engaged in. It's a constant struggle against that mixture of amnesia and nostalgia, against forgetting how recent it is that we live like this, and then forgetting that actually, absent anesthesia and good dental work, you don't want to live in the 19th century, right? We don't want to live in the period that we were studying. Now that sort of argument could be generalised, and one obvious way in which it can be generalised is to think that model of history and that model of disciplinarity in properly global perspective. For most of my career, after all, it was assumed that the arrow of history pointed west. That what a series of poets and chroniclers and historians have constantly told us was true, so that the more recent, the more advanced, and the more modern the science and technology one was describing, the further west the place where it was being made. And the Eurocentrism, and indeed Anglo-Americanocentrism of our discipline, is a consequence of that great illusion. And I think the single most important and exciting thing that is happening and could possibly happen to the discipline that I've been trained in is completely and seriously to abandon that intellectual map, so that one no longer assumes that that's the arrow of history, and on the contrary, one goes back to the, for example, 18th century, confident in the knowledge that the loss of economic and political leadership by the Qing in the 1790s through 1848 was just a temporary blip, probably. This would be roughly to re-ask the Needham question then, but with a completely different premise. I mean, Needham, for very understandable reasons, the greatest historian of science of the 20th century, for understandable reasons, assumed that the question was, why only in Europe, given the Chinese achievement? Though the what was only in Europe, of course, was never quite defined. But forget about that. Why only in Europe? Well, what if one inverted the question and said, rather, why this temporary and perhaps aberrant change in the intellectual and technical map of the world? And that, I think, would change our whole field, and because of what I've said about disciplinarity, almost all other fields as well, right? And I think the kinds of conversation that one would have in 10, 20, 30 years about what all this is for and where one can be creative would start from a completely different place, literally from a completely different place, but certainly cognitively from a completely different place. And I think that is worth stressing, that the premise of our work must change completely in the next generation, and it will.